Like your textbook points out, the era from roughly 1870 to 1900 was known as the Gilded Age, and it's so named because the period had an unprecedented level of economic and cultural wealth and development. During this time, the United States saw this growth stemming largely from an increase in technological innovation, industry, immigration, and laissez-faire market, or an economy that has little to no government interference. This lecture is going to cover what I term as part 1 of the Gilded Age. Your textbook has it as chapter 16. Part 2 sort of picks up on chapter 17, but there's going to be a lot of back and forth between the two chapters. There are roughly 6 different categories or characteristics of the Gilded Age. Industry with subcategories of innovation and technology, money, corruption, labor, urban life, and leisure. Within each of these characteristics or categories, as you will, we see definite change from where Americans have been in the previous 2 centuries. So we're going to start off first talking about industry. Now, the key aspect of industry during the Gilded Age is that we've finally entered the second industrial revolution. The first industrial revolution is characterized by a use of steam power, and the second is primarily characterized by the use of electric power. It lasts from approximately 1870 to 1911, and those 3 key things that sort of describe the second industrial revolution are a development of national transportation and communication, particularly when it comes to the advent of the railroad and the telegraph. The development of faster transportation and communication goes hand in hand with the development of a national and international economic market, which again, more money is getting traded all over the United States and abroad, which is going to grow the American economy even more. We also, very importantly, sort of discover a way to harness and distribute electricity in 1882. And that is going to, I don't have to explain to you how important it is, the discovery of electricity, but, suffice it to say that it is significant in terms of industry. And the last thing that the second industrial revolution has as a characteristic is the marriage between science and industry. Because of the increase of science during the 19th century, we developed new products, for example, like electricity, or maybe the ability to take crude oil that comes from the ground and figure out different processes to make things like gasoline, which, powers cars and other said things, and kerosene, which can be used for lighting or can be used for cooking or can be used for heat. So that creates an entirely new industry. And then the inclusion of science also figures out how to make things a little bit more efficient and faster, and that is going to lower prices on materials that they have overall. For example, it's during this time that they figure out a way to create steel more efficiently by using pig ore. And so the mining of the iron ore becomes more efficient during this time. They figure out different ways to get it hotter, faster, and how to actually lay it into steel beams. And that is going to create things like how faster laying of railroad ties, building taller buildings, a whole myriad of different things. So those 3 characteristics of the second industrial revolution are the increase of transportation and communication, the use of electric power, and the marriage between science and industry. Now, of course, perhaps the most important aspect to the Gilded Age actually happens before the Gilded Age even sort of takes place, and that would be the development of the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, they started to build the Transcontinental Railroad with the passage of the Pacific Railroads Act in 1862, but arguably they had been trying to get a nationwide railroad going in the United States since before the Compromise of 1850. So this had been a long-term goal that seriously got interrupted by the Civil War. Okay. It was finished in 1881, and it involved a heavy amount of federal sort of hand-holding and interference to make it happen. In particular, the federal government used a process known as eminent domain, where they can take personally held lands and say that this is for the good of the country or the good of your individual city or town. They'll give you a quote-unquote fair market value for this land, and then they do whatever they want with it. So in the case of the railroad, they used eminent domain to actually give railroad companies land, roughly 129 million acres, in order to lay their tracks and build the train stations. This equated to about $335 million in land value. Then they subsidized the building of the railroad for about $707 million in cash value. They also led the two railroads their sort of military might, allowing the federal army to, clear out the Native Americans so that they could build railroads through the lands that they had pushed the Plains Indians into. The railroad was really important because it allowed U.S. Citizens and immigrants to expand into the West. It was also important because it made it a lot easier to migrate and settle those areas. And it was definitely important to the development of our economy. But we also have to consider the morality of the Transcontinental Railroad. It was heavily subsidized by the federal government, and it was a big factor leading into the Indian Wars. But those who benefited financially from it were the wealthy railroad owners and not really the U.S. people. The general population, you could argue, benefited in other ways. Towns sprung up overnight and were given sort of their wealth. Americans were able to get cheaper products like cattle and hogs and corn to market faster, which lowered the cost of living overall. But, overall, the people who benefited the most are going to be some of these robber barons and tycoons that we're going to talk about in a little bit. So one of the questions that you have to ask yourself, and I encourage you to do so as a part of your critical thinking exercises, is, was the U.S. government right in supporting this? If we were in class right now, I would take a moment and ask you guys to give me your thoughts on this, but really just consider sort of the long effects of history. Did the U.S. benefit so much from the development of this nationwide railroad to offset the amount of money that was given for it and almost the mass genocide of a group of people that were already living there? So just sort of food for thought. Now, one industry that definitely benefited from this Transcontinental Railroad and from all of the characteristics of the Gilded Age was the development of the meatpacking industry. And the biggest meat packer in the country during the Gilded Age and arguably into the 20th century were the Union stockyards based out of Chicago. So the stockyards opened on Christmas Day during the last year of the Civil War, and they lasted all the way up until 1971. And Chicago was a pretty key part of this meatpacking industry because of its geographic location. It was a starting or a stopping point for almost every major railroad. And it was able to centralize a lot of the industry. And you'll see some slides going forward in a second, so you'll understand what I'm talking about. Now, the stockyards were a place where the livestock was taken from the trains in the hinterland in Texas, Wyoming, Cheyenne, wherever they got on at. And then they were driven to holding pens, where then they were then further taken into butchering factories, where they would be slaughtered, packaged, and then the meat would be put back onto special iced and air conditioned for 1860s time train cars, and then sent eastward and all over the country. And so for things that we sort of take for granted today, you can go to a grocery store and get a steak or a chicken breast, whatever the case may be. For people living in the 1900s, the 19th century, the 1800s, if you wanted to get meat, you either had to cut it yourself or you had to go to a local butcher. And let's say the butcher's out of pork chops, well, then the butcher's out of pork chops. It's not like you can, go to another store, whatever the case may be. Your town may only have one butcher. So when you have an industry now that has developed that allows people to get meat whenever they want, it's going to drastically change not just their diets, but also American culture as a whole. And so the stockyards are really innovative for American culture, but they're also a great example of the Gilded Age because they're going to demonstrate all of these things that we're talking about. They centralize the industry. Before, as individual butchers, now 3 big conglomerates are coming together. They use the advantages of science to figure out the best ways to, whether it be through slaughtering a cow or how to package meat and ship it all over the country, or even what to do with the parts that you can't eat, like the hair off of a pig being used for brush bristles or cow tails. And they also incorporate all of these different ethnic groups that are coming into the United States during this time and all of the labor problems that we have. So they're a really good lens at which to look at the Gilded Age, and I'm probably going to come back to them again and again throughout this lecture. So I apologize to all you guys who are getting grossed out, but meat eating is a fact of life, and so you should know how your meat gets to your table, right? Or at least how it got to your table in the 19th century. So this journey to, the dinner table oftentimes started at the stockyard gates, which are depicted here. You can see that there's just sort of sheep mulling about, and literally what would happen is that the sheep would be put on a train. The train would arrive at the stockyards, and then they would be sort of just driven into the stockyards, into their pens. So here's a picture of what those pens look like. So the cows would wait in whatever the cows, lambs, sheep, pigs, calves, whatever the case may be, they would wait in these pens. And then if you could see in the background where it says Swift and Armor, those are the actual meatpacking plants. So someone would drive the cattle back there where they would then be butchered. Now, once the animals got into the factories, this is where we see another sort of innovation in how people were actually butchering and creating meat. Before, a butcher had to be a skilled individual who knew how to cut every single chop of meat, whether it be bacon or pork chop, But with the stockyards and with a lot of other slaughterhouse areas as well. We have, I believe, some in Fort Worth too. One of the innovations that they did is they separated out the jobs. So it would be one person's job to stun the animal, which is a nice way to say kill the animal first. It'd be another person's job to attach that pig to, as you can see here, a big wheel, where then they would be bloodletted, which is another person's job, probably not the best job in the factory. And, they would then go through the whole cutting process. And so each job had a different person in charge of it. And so when we talk about innovation in the Gilded Age, this is one of those innovations that we're talking about, because the separation out of jobs and skills between people who would be considered skilled labor versus unskilled labor, that's completely new. That's a completely new innovation. Today, it seems sort of common sense, right? We even have, you can get your degree in, I think it's called organizational management, where you can be the person to figure out what is the most efficient way for something like, let's say, Amazon to run, right? During the 1900s or 19th century, this is completely new. But another reason why the stockyards are a perfect example of the Gilded Age is because they are an example of what unregulated business can do. And so what you're looking at here are two images of what it becomes known as Bubbly Creek, which is an offshoot from the Chicago River. And it was a place where the factories, because no one said that they couldn't, pushed their unused animal waste and into the river. And so if you look closely, you can see that on the picture on the left, there's a person standing on the river. And on the right, you can see some of the animals that are standing on the river too. These images are not taken in winter. That river is not frozen over. Instead, it is all of the animal fat and solid waste matters and trash and all that other sort of stuff that might come with an industry that was reliant on butchering, pushing all of that into a river. So the river became almost solid, full of waste. And it became known as Bubbly Creek because as the older animal carcasses that were, sinking to the bottom as they decomposed, the gases that the decomposing body let off would rise to the surface and the river would bubble. Okay. Now, the neighborhoods surrounding the stockyards become known as Back of the Yards and Canaryville. And as you can imagine, if you guys have ever driven through the country on a hot summer day, with your windows down, these areas did not smell particularly nice. So to add to that, you've got a literal creek that's running by, contaminating your drinking water supply, by the way, and is pretty much an open space for decomposing bodies and animal renderings. Adding to that, you also have a lot of smoke and ash in the air because for the things that they didn't push off into Bubbly Creek, they put into open sort of fire pits, and that's how they burned their trash. And so you can imagine if you are a person that lives near this factory, how you might feel every day when you send your kids out. Your last warnings might be, don't go near the creek and watch out for fire pits, okay? I don't think I would be very comfortable sending my 3-year-old outside, but everyone did. So you had a wealth of sort of hazards that came with having these industries that were unregulated. And they created a significant amount of money for those people at the top, but created a significant amount of problems for those people at the bottom. So we'll keep talking about that as we go on through today's lecture. And again, I apologize. I know, I hope no one's eating while they're listening to this as well. Now, those people at the top were oftentimes known as robber barons. They could also be called captains of industry, and it sort of depended on where you sat as to whether or not they were good guys or bad guys. In general, though, they were men who were the leaders of their particular field of industry. If they were a captain of industry, they were seen as sort of these behemoth men, these admirable guys who, picked themselves up off of their bootstraps and were able to, create all this massive amount of wealth on their own. If they were bad guys in your eyes, they created that wealth off of the backs of others who they underpaid and created, poor working conditions and living conditions for those individuals. They were often seen as unregulated, corrupt, and unscrupulous. Like I said, your textbook will talk more about these individuals. Some of the more common ones I've listed here and what their particular field was. You guys probably have heard of all of these guys except for maybe Jay Gould, and that is probably because he was basically run out of the country for his corruption. The rest of them all had pretty lasting effects on the United States. These guys were all both industry, captains, but they were also philanthropists. And it creates this sort of conflict sometimes, because how should we view someone like Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, who basically stole a lot of land from Americans in order to lay his railroads and profited off of the Civil War, but then also gave away almost all of his money? How do we deal with that? Or Andrew Carnegie, who is a self-made man. He was an immigrant from Scotland, and he too, like the Commodore, was able to consolidate a lot of his business interests and make a ton of money off of capitalizing on a new industry of making steel. He also believed in giving away all of his money, and one of the things that he gave his money away to most frequently were libraries in small towns. But the steel industry also had some of the worst and most hazardous working conditions, and he overwhelmingly hired small children because they could fit into small places, and a lot of children died in his factories. How do we deal with that? And so the problem with robber barons, when we look at them from our lens of today, is that these are the guys that give us this mythology that anyone is capable of creating an industry and being an entrepreneur and going from rags to riches, and that we should all be responsible for our own sort of success in life. And that's a great way to sort of look at this American dream, because we have the freedom to do that. However, there are sacrifices. And what these individuals were able to do wasn't without someone else making a sacrifice on their behalf. And so having these people set up in history as these great men, which again, they are impressive individuals, it can also be really damaging to how we view industry and regulation, and even how we view poverty today, right? I'm sure you guys have all heard of someone who said, well, that person should just go out and get a job, right? But at the same time, if any of you guys have tried to get a job, you know that it might be a little bit more difficult than, as it may seem. So again, thinking about, another one of these critical thinking exercises, how do we view history in the long term? You can really look at something like the robber barons as one of those examples. Now, it may seem slightly confusing after reading your book as to how these robber barons or captains of industry were able to, become these captains of industry. So I just wanted to go over some of the key terms. So one of the ways that people like Carnegie and Rockefeller were able to amass their fortunes is by using a device known as a trust. And a trust is a legal device where several rival companies come together and then they are managed by a single director. This is what happened in the Union stockyards. They had Armour and Swift and I believe Meyer. They were all rival meat packers, and they all had the same problem as we're losing lots of money because we don't have a centralized location for the animals to be driven to. So together they created a trust, okay, which was the Union Stockyards. That was the name of it. And then that trust purchased land, and that's where they built all of their new butchering factories and the stockyards and so on and so forth. Now, a trust is great because it allows those companies to sort of streamline operations. But what about those other businessmen, those other butchers, right? It put a lot of mom and pops out of business. Now, another way that you can structure your company is through vertical integration. And that's what Carnegie and Vanderbilt and Rockefeller all did, is they made sure that they controlled every phase of the business from the raw material to the actual distribution. So using an example like today, let's use McDonald's. McDonald's is another vertically integrated company. They have exclusive contracts with farmers who grow specific types of potatoes. They give them the seeds, they give them the fertilizer, they give them the pesticide to grow those types of potatoes the way that they want. Those potatoes are then shipped on McDonald's trucks to McDonald's sorting plants to, the freezing plants where they freeze the fries, and then on McDonald's trucks again to their individual stores where they are then sold. McDonald's controls every aspect of your French fry, right? That's vertical integration. Horizontal expansion, that's where we start to get into some more legally murky areas because that's buying out the competition. And so if you see McDonald's sees that they're getting competition from, gosh, I don't know, Burger King. Or if you guys have watched The Founder on Netflix, you can maybe see some examples of horizontal expansion where they try to buy out their competition. That, and again, is something that can lead to monopolies, which is the exclusive possession or control or the supply of a trade in a commodity or service. Back in the 90s, Microsoft was found guilty of having a monopoly, and they got to that point because of their horizontal expansion, because they would go in and buy out the competition. Oh, great example. Facebook does it today, right? Facebook does it today, but they keep those companies like Instagram and Snapchat underneath their same titles so that they can't be accused of a monopoly even though they own it, right? Now, all of this isn't necessarily the most up and up. And so we do have some reforms that take place in the latter half of the Gilded Age and into the Progressive Era that try to reform these corruptions, namely the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. The solution that the government came up with to correct a lot of the corruption problems and unregulation of the Gilded Age was the Sherman Act of 1890. Now, by and large, the Sherman Act could do two things. First, it could restrain trade between states and foreign nations. It could restrain fixing prices. It could limit industrial output and share markets or exclude competition. And second, it could forbid monopolies. It further allowed the government to force violators to dissolve their companies. It allowed the government to issue injunctions to limit illegal practices, and to impose any fines or possibly imprisonment for anyone who broke the law. It also allowed private parties who may be injured by any illegal practices from the government to actually sue for damages. So, for example, if the Chicago stockyards, their practices with getting rid of their animal off-put created a bad environment and someone got sick, it allowed an individual to actually sue the stockyards for breaking the law. And that actually did happen. The government put new environmental regulations into place, and when the stockyards frequently broke it, they were held culpable to those lawsuits. But it was really hard to enforce. Largely because of the judicial interpretations of what constitutes a trade or a commerce among states. And it ended up backfiring more often than not, and is most effectively held against trade unions, which were thought to be illegal combinations brought together. So, case in point, one of the examples where it sort of backfires is with the Pullman sleeper car strike in Chicago. And when that strike threatened to hold up all of railroad activity and subsequently interstate commerce until the strike was resolved, the federal government sent troops in and was able to sort of bust up that strike. To correct that, by the time that we get to the 1914s, we're in a different era, the Progressive Era, and don't worry, we'll talk about that. But the Clayton Antitrust Act, which more narrowly defined the Sherman Act and what constituted a monopoly, and then the Federal Trade Commission, which created a whole separate government agency to actually oversee business practices. In general, though, if you haven't already figured it out, it was a bad time to be poor during the Gilded Age. If you were poor and you were working a wage-earning job, you were at the whim of an unregulated economy and unregulated working conditions. So that meant that your average work week could be anywhere from 10 hours a day, 6 to 7 days a week, for about an average work week of 59 hours a week, and that's at an average. So that means that some people worked more, and unfortunately, some people worked less too. There was no regulation for workplace safety. A lot of people died on the job, either through getting caught up in the machinery or perhaps in the steel industry, suffering from severe third-degree burns, or even in some cases, like in coal mines, getting crushed or dying from diseases that were common in that industry, like the black lung. You also had severely low pay. On average, you would probably earn about $3.50 an hour, and that's in 2005 dollars. So you had to work every single day, otherwise you wouldn't be able to afford to live. And if you missed a day due to injury or sickness, you were at severe risk of being not able to eat, not being able to feed your children, or possibly even being evicted from your house. There was also child labor, and by 1880, about 1 out of every 6 kids worked full-time. Parents did this for a couple of reasons. By and large, they needed every person in the family to actually work in order to survive. So that meant that a lot of kids wouldn't be educated, and like I mentioned earlier, they oftentimes had some of the most dangerous jobs. For example, if you look at the bottom right picture there, those are children who worked in the coal industry, and their jobs would be to climb into the smallest of crevices and extract the coal from there. And the reason why these crevices were so small is because they couldn't actually widen them out without interfering with the structure of the caves and the tunnels. If they made it too big, it might actually collapse. So those children spent their 10 hours a day in really dark, dank, and claustrophobic situations. And to make things even worse, one while there was a lot of factory work, you had no job guarantee. They didn't regulate industries like we do today. They didn't, take numbers, we're selling 1,000 units a week. Subsequently, we can hire this many people and, we'll have them work year round. The job market was very dependent on supply and demand. So you may work one season in one industry and then all of a sudden, the seasons switch and subsequently there's not need for that anymore. So if you're making sweaters, for example, you probably won't make sweaters in the summer and you'll have to go find other work. So for all of these reasons, there wasn't that safety net of employment that we have today. And keep this in mind, because when we get to the Great Depression, you need to understand that this is how the economy worked up until the Great Depression. And so when people start losing jobs, they don't have any sort of financial savings or other types of employment to fall back on. Now, those labor problems with being poor, of course, manifested into some good things as well, specifically with the development of union and worker protections. So it's during the Gilded Age that the poor working conditions motivate a lot of people to join together and try to correct the situations. But in these early days of the unions, they didn't have a lot of success. Strikes were pretty unorganized. They would happen, for short bits of time at individual factories, and scabs, that sort of term for people who will cross the picket lines and go and work. They were pretty easily found, specifically among, newer immigrant groups or people of color who didn't necessarily have steady employment and needed to take it when they could find it. Going along with that, many different ethnic groups and races saw themselves in competition with others. It was very frequent that certain ethnic groups would work in certain industries, and they didn't want to join together across those lines because they felt that their group's jobs might be at risk. For example, in the Union stockyards, like we've been talking about, the Irish Americans tended to be the foremen. The groups underneath them, mostly Lithuanians and Poles, they tended to have like the less skilled work. And then the African Americans and Mexican Americans tended to be sort of the cleanup crew. They had the dirtiest of jobs. And it took a long time for those groups to overcome their, racism and their fears of joining together to actually form a union. And the stockyards don't actually get union representation until the late 20s and early 30s. A lot of these ethnic groups and immigrant groups also had no ties to America or their industry. They didn't think that they would be at that job for very long. And as wage labor becomes a more permanent mainstay of the American economy, that's when we start to see more movement in better job security and job treatment. So one of those first major labor organizations is the Knights of Labor in 1869. They advocated for things like an 8-hour workday, for paper currency, which is really important because very frequently employers would try to pay in goods that they made. They also argued for a government bureau of labor statistics to keep track of what was happening so that it can be better regulated and monitored. And they advocated and were successful in getting national arbitration law for labor disputes, which allowed individuals who had legal qualms with their employers to actually sue them. Before, you couldn't do that. It was illegal. They allowed all wage workers to be joined into the union, and interestingly enough, they allowed women as well, and that's what that picture over on your left shows. So they were a fairly successful group, and they grew to about, I think, 400,000 at their highest, but after some bad protests, which we'll talk about in strikes in a second, their numbers, they lost a lot of numbers very quickly. Another union that had some success was the American Federation of Law in 1886. And whereas the Knights of Labor allowed all wage workers in, the AFL, as it's known today, only allowed specialized and skilled work. And they felt that if they joined a union like the Knights of Labor, which allowed unskilled workers, it could actually hurt their own collective bargaining and their own job prospects. So Knights of Labor allows everyone. The AFL, which is still a union today, focuses on skilled labor. And then the last thing we need to talk about too is during this time we get the concept of anarchism that rises up amongst these union groups. And anarchism isn't, maybe what you think it is, where that A and red A with a circle. You probably saw some kids in high school that wore that sort of anarchy symbol. Anarchism in the 19th century is a term to describe this idea that any government was an abusive device used by the rich and the powerful to oppress the poor and exploiting the working poor. So when people in the 1900s said that they were anarchists, they were against basically all government, all economies, and all wealth, because they thought that those were just systems in place to make their lives worse. Now, one last thing I want to talk about with unions before we get into some other finer points is that a lot of these unions start out arguing for utopian and socialist attributes, but they're not unique in that. This is sort of a cultural movement across the 19th century as well. Employers also thought that a lot of these utopian and socialist ideas were good ideas, but they thought it was a good idea because they would be able to control their workers. Workers thought it was a good idea because they wanted to be able to control their employers. So on both sides, when you hear a lot of or read a lot of this socialist or idealism in their primary sources, what they're trying to do is benefit the system to help themselves. So one of the events that leads to a decline in union power and membership in the 19th century is the Haymarket bombing. And we need to look at the Haymarket bombing because it's sort of this touchstone moment where we see a lot of the negative thoughts that we have about unions emerging during this time. So this idea that unions are not necessarily good for the American economy, or that union workers or advocators are socialists or communists. A lot of that stems from this particular event. So what actually happens? Well, first and foremost, you need to know that this takes place in Chicago, and the Chicago unions had organized a May Day strike on May 1st, where they were marching from factory to factory, getting more workers to leave their posts to come and advocate for an 8-hour workday. And the initial May Day strike was very peaceful, and it had city support. The mayor was even out there and spoke at the event, but the police officers thought that it was getting a little unruly, and they tried to break it up. And when they did that, one of the strikers was murdered. Okay, a police officer shot into the crowd, and he had been killed. So then on May 4th, they come out again and they protest the killing of one of the strikers who had been killed on the previous day. And at this time, a bomb explodes in the Haymarket, which is a square location, and it kills one police officer. And at this point, the May Day strikes and the strikes and the sentiment towards labor completely switches. They bring together about 8 anarchists, one of which was Albert Parsons, who was one of the key Chicago leaders of the labor movement. And they charged them all with conspiracy of death. Albert Parsons wasn't even present at the bombing, but he was charged with conspiring to provoke violence. All 8 were tried, and sentenced to death. And 4 were actually executed. Now, the trial in itself was considered a little bit controversial because they didn't necessarily have any evidence that they presented in court, but they were still found guilty. The other reason why it was controversial is that these 8 individuals were sort of chosen because they were the most likely to be suspected because of their political ties to the anarchist movement and because they were all immigrants. Several of them didn't even speak English. So there were a lot of emotions that were stirred up by this bombing. Whatever the case may be, when we look at a lot of the newspapers of the day, the May Day strike on the 1st was celebrated sort of nationwide. Everyone was like, this is a great idea. We should have an 8-hour workday. Everyone, including employers, were even participating in this event. By the time that we get to May 4th and May 5th, everyone is anti-union. They're seen as rabble rousers and terrorists and all sorts of demonstrative language. And so the Haymarket really demoralizes the labor movement. With it, the Knights of Labor fade, and because it became associated with the wild-eyed bomb throwers to a lot of middle-class minds, and then we get the AFL emerging. Now, if unions were trying to figure out ways to control their employer, and the government was trying to figure out ways to control both parties, company towns were a way for the employer to figure out ways to control their workers. Employers had a lot of complaints about workers at this time. They were oftentimes unreliable because you didn't have necessarily payrolls and you didn't necessarily hire people for long-term jobs. You could not guarantee how many people would show up to your factory on a given day. if they did, oftentimes they might be intoxicated or may not stay throughout the entire shift, and you couldn't necessarily even judge their capabilities when they were there. They may say that they are skilled, but they find out that they're unskilled. And to add with all of that, companies are trying to figure out ways around this union problem. They don't want unions to organize in their industries. And one of the ways that they figured out that they could do this is by offering sort of, a carrot and a stick scenario. You say you need better wages so you can afford better housing. Well, fine. What about if I build you a better house and we keep the wages as is? And so that was sort of the motivation for what becomes known as a company town. And a company town is a place where practically all of these stores and housing and any other infrastructure are owned by one company that is also the main employer of that town's citizens. Company towns, they tried to be sort of this utopian, perfect, ideal place to live, but in reality, it tied the worker to their employer in oftentimes borderline illegal ways, meaning that it restricted their labor and their wages so much that the employee became entrapped or indebted to that employer. A lot of times, company towns tried to be altruistic, but on their own terms. For example, Pullman, which was created luxury train cars, they had libraries and lectures and other cultural events, but they also prohibited the sale and consumption of alcohol in the city limits. They required all their employees to live there if they wanted a job, and they had to pay high rents in order to live there as well. They could only buy their food, clothing, whatever have you from the company stores. They also forced religious participation and sometimes only paid them in company credit so that they could only buy from their company. And so Pullman does this because he believes that a lot of the social ills in society during that time result from poor living conditions and alcohol and a lack of religion. And this is a really common belief amongst sort of that 1% during the Gilded Age, that all of society's problems could be boiled down to those, small things. And so he's like, I will fix all of this. And you can see what Pullman looked like in that bottom right-hand corner there. It's very organized, nice brick houses, all that other sort of thing. But the employees hated it. And I think it's pretty easy to understand why. I mean, we wouldn't like to be told by our employer where we could worship, what we could eat or drink in our own house, and all these other things that we have to do on their terms, right? And so, in general, company towns, even though they're trying to make adjust for some of those worker complaints, they tend up being more oppressive. And some of the worst company towns are the ones that surround the coal industry, because in those cases, the companies own the minerals underneath the land, and subsequently nothing could be done on top of the land. And so, like you'll see in the top right-hand corner, there's a picture from a company town, I believe in West Virginia. And they built them houses, right, and fairly substantial houses. But you can see around there that, there's rubbish on the street, and these workers are living in an environment that's not necessarily good for their health. And coal towns are notorious for only allowing purchases from the company store, and they were able to do so because they were so remote as well. So a lot of employees actually suffered underneath these quote-unquote utopian societies.